Let me open the discussion, Nora and Luca, with the topic of complexities in our society. When the COVID-19 pandemic emerged, people's immediate focus was on the health responses. But soon it also revealed how the pandemic is actually affecting every part of our lives, exposing complexities and fragilities that we feel we have actually never really been exposed to in the way we are now. There seem to be many different approaches trying to make sense of what is happening and trying to unpack complexities in societies and how to respond. Nora, based on your work on improving the perception of complexity in societies, how should we unpack or make sense of complexity in our societies?
Well, I first of all, I just want to say that this is a much different question now than it was even 7 months ago to respond to, and that's largely because I think of the pandemic and the way in which our lives have all been changed by this itty bitty little virus that came and revealed all sorts of intersystemic fragility. And prior to this, if in my work, talking about intersystemic fragility is some kind of abstraction. And to say we need to think about health and education and economy and politics and law and history and culture, they're all connected, they're all interdependent. And people would look at me like, why is she saying all this abstract stuff? We just need something we can do on Monday. I work in education. This is what I do. So I need to be able to do this. Or I work in health, or I work in politics. This is my job. And then after a few months of having everything really tipped over, it's like we had 17 different buckets of paint and they all spilled into each other. And in that moment, it became very clear that health has everything to do with education, has everything to do with technology, has everything to do with family, that the policies around dealing with the pandemic were received culturally. They weren't just laws. And that these things that were previously conveniently, but I think as an illusion, kept in their discrete boxes, they stopped being, it was impossible. And that has actually, I think, brought this moment forward, maybe a decade forward, where we can actually have a conversation now about the complexity that we're dealing with without having to go into this sort of glossy abstraction. It's pretty real. People's kids are in their living rooms. They're, home with their families. Their economy is hurting. Their elders have been sick. Maybe some of them have been sick. You leave the house with a mask in your pocket. It's real. This is not some theoretical thing anymore. So the complexity, how should we work with this complexity? I guess the first thing that I have to say about that is just we got to stop underestimating it and stop thinking, oh, what we really need is a simple way to deal with complexity. We just need simple methodologies and recognize that hasn't gotten us very far. So for me, that's the big one, has to do more with a kind of attitude and a way of looking at life. Ultimately, it's there. And then the rigor of that, the intellectual work, the practical work is something that comes out of that shift.
Thank you, Laura. You have a board behind you entitled Warm Data, but while I can't read the details from a distance, I do recall from your recent blog that you're actually asking the question if people's response to the emergencies of the coming decades will be warm or cold. What is warm data, and what do you mean by a response being warm or cold?
Okay, so warm data is basically the idea that there's another kind of information, and that other kind of information has been there all along. We didn't call it out, um, and it's the information that is the relational processes that bring complex systems together, and it's not information that you can measure. It's not information that you can define. It's not information that you can repeat. I'll give you an example. So if I were to say to you, where is the information? Where is the learning around how you learn to play violin? Where is that? Is it in your muscles? Is it in your relationship with your teacher? Is it in relationship to the music? Is it emotional? Is it in the design and the carpentry of the violin itself? Is it cultural? Is it history? Is it in the written notes of the music itself? Is it in the audience? Where is the learning? And that is, I think, a good example of, because obviously it's in the relationship between all of those things. And if you wanted to measure that learning, where would you go to measure it? How would you measure connection to cultural history or emotional response to a piece of music? Or the way in which the reading of the music is in some way in affect with the relationship to the teacher. So where is that? And framed in that space, that kind of systemic, complex system learning is it's safe and it's over there and it's violin and it's easy. We can look at that. But when you start to look at how a city and the infrastructure of the city, how the planning is happening, how we're thinking about the future of education for our children, the stakes get higher. And when the stakes get higher, there's even more of an urge to define, to measure, and to go into a way of looking at information that pulls things out of context. Basic reductionism science is what we're talking about. Nothing wrong with it. It serves a great bunch of purposes in life. But it does not tell us about how the complex system itself is moving and learning. Right? So this is where the warm data comes in and why it's transcontextual. So how multiple contexts, like your muscles, like your relationship to teacher, like the emotions, like the intellectual engagement with the music or the culture or the, right, all these things are present. But they're present in relationship. And so how we think about that information is a slippery thing, but it's absolutely vital. It is arguably where the music comes from. So the transcontextual process there requires that we think about information in a new way. And that's basically what warm data is. It's recognizing that there's a lot of processes going on that cannot be extracted and measured and labeled and listed. And like it or not, those are the processes that create the vitality of a system. Sometimes that vitality of the system is in fact destructive of other systems. Right? So you could look at, a lot of the properties of our current economic system and say that the vitality, the relational process, the transcontextual relational process inherent in existing economic models they brings together an idea of identity in which my influence, my desirability, my relevance in society is measured in wealth or shiny things or positioning. But also, we're talking about ownership and control, and we're talking about possibilities for moving things. It's cultural, it's historic, it's political, it's legal. And so the way in which all of those are in relationship to each other is what gives the process its vitality. It makes it very hard to change, right? How do you, I mean, in a way, I think what we're talking about here today is systems change. How do you change systems when they have all these multiple processes, multiple determinism, as Gregory was talking about in this article we're discussing today? And in order to get to that, you need another kind of information that doesn't park things with the same ease. It requires another kind of rigor. And it's a rigor of seeing things in their living process. That's basically what warm data is.
Very interesting. Thank you, Nora. Can you perhaps elaborate a bit more on the latter part of this, another type of approach, another type of way of looking at that you just finished with? Because in a way, what we see in our environment in UNDP and in the broader development community, but also, I guess, more globally, is that we got quite comfortable in thinking in these boxes that you described, or in these, separations. And in this moment of all these boxes falling and the color spilling over, to use the picture that you used before, I guess we feel more chaos than actual opportunity for new order. So how do you actually start that sense making in this complexity that we're facing?
Well, I'm working with it at a couple of different levels, and one of the levels is actually the community level. So ultimately, I think it's been there's been some confusion around whether you change policy to change culture or change culture to change policy, and it's a lot easier in a kind of the momentum of a direct corrective. And this is something I think that also kind of comes up here, that you get this idea, right, that you have like, this is the problem, and we want to like identify the problem. We want to describe it. We want to get more and more and more specific so that we can get ever more strategic about how to get this problem over to a solution over here, right? And here's our bright solution, but we've got to go step by step by step by step to get there. And in fact, this problem was not the problem. It was a consequence. And it was a consequence of multiple conditions, relational process taking place through multiple conditions. And so this thing of the way in which our whole world has developed its response system to even describing what a problem is has to do with blinding us to the complex conditions that created it. And so it would appear that the solution has to be about the problem. But the solution isn't about the problem. The solution is about the conditions. It's about understanding the relationship between the conditions. I mean, let's say this thing is poverty, right? You're not going to solve poverty. Poverty is in education, in economics, in culture, in religion, in family, in history, in law, right? And it's all those things coming together. But this idea of a direct corrective hijacks possibility of working with those relational processes because it was easy. Because it was something we could grab onto. It's just like that old story about the guy, with drops his keys and he's looking for his keys under the street lamp, and someone comes up and says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm looking for my keys." And he says, "Is this where you dropped it?" He says, "No, but this is where the light is." And this is what's happening, is that there's all sorts of solutioning happening in this format of linear strategic process. And the things that we need to work on don't come in that shape. So, it's been, it's I guess it's a holdover from, just basic mechanistic thinking, and something goes wrong with your car, you just find the part that's broken and you identify that part and then you replace it and you fix it. And in a complex living system, you cannot fix the parts to make it better. You can't fix education to make a better culture. You can't fix culture to make a better education system. You have to work with the relationship between culture and education. And where is that? Where's the department of in-betweenness? We don't have that. We have cultural departments and we have educational departments. We have people whose job it is to do this or to do that, but they are not in any way ready to have a kind of stance to be able to respond to the things that are coming up in our world, and the things that are going to continue to come, because we have used up quite a bit of what my dad was talking about with the ecological flexibility. And so now, and we've used up cultural flexibility as well. A lot of the social flexibility is also spent. So now we're looking at a time when people are experiencing the breakdown of institutions and the breakdown of ecological climate and so on, and the breakdown of global economics. And then comes a virus.
Mm.
So where's the problem? How do we address this?
Mm.
So I think it's really an important time to be brave and to recognize that even though the habituated pragmatic approach is the dominant one, it isn't actually able to meet the complexity of our times.
Mm. In our work with Luca and the Chora Foundation on designing a portfolio of development options at the city level, a lot of these interconnectedness that you're referring to, Nora, finds reflection. And you also mentioned in the beginning of our discussion, you work at the community level. You referred to some of the work that you've been observing in cities, smart cities, and so forth. Is that an entry point for you where you could see the nucleus or the ingredients of change coming together in a conducive manner?
I see the shift, the most productive shift taking place when groups of people, communities of people, actually begin to perceive and to learn together about the interdependencies that they live within. So, the journalism and the media and the education system and, basically every system we've been within has reiterated a kind of reductionist view of life. And people are simply not accustomed to speaking of how things are complex, even if they experience it day in and day out. So that to me has been something that has been really groundbreaking and exciting, and gives me so much hope. And what's fascinating is that I have found that working with communities that are really the most betrayed, that are in the worst condition, those communities of people can and do begin to actually use very high level complexity thinking much faster than communities that are comfortable. If you're living in poverty, what a systemic problem is. You know, because you live it. And it has to do with not being able to have the transportation to get to a good job, not being able to get health care. Your kids don't have a future. They don't have a good education. You don't have the financial ability to buy a house, so you end up spending all your money in rent. You don't have the support of other people around you. You can't afford childcare, and so on and so on. It's a systemic issue. Whereas communities that are more comfortable are more likely to be looking at their comfort, their wealth, as something that was produced through a linear system. I earned this money. I was entitled to this money. This is the way life is. I did it right, and therefore I got the prize. But for large portions of the world, no matter how right you do it, you don't get the prize. And so communities of people who are betrayed, I think that's the best way to describe it, have actually, in my experience, a much faster entry point into high-level complexity thinking and responses to it, which is, I think, fascinating. In terms of the assumption being that if you are in trauma that you can't perceive in this way, or that without a high-level education, or that somehow complexity thinking is reserved for a particular elite. And I would say that's absolutely not true. And that it's important because, if you look at what happened with Macron, for example, and he put that gas tax in, and didn't deal with the transcontextual issues. And the populations of people who really felt the complexity that got overlooked were who? Right? It was the people who were in the working class, who couldn't go to work, who the gas tax affected in lots of different ways. And then it became a race issue, and then it became a religious issue, and then it started to gather momentum. But this is what is going to happen if the communities themselves are not able to perceive the interdependency that actually we need to deal with. And luckily, right now, this is the moment to have those conversations because they're ready to see it. So that's what I'm mostly seeing is in terms of cities and communities, that it's really about shifting the question: what world do you live in? What world are we living in? Are we living in a world where your kids are going to grow up and get a job and have a house like you? And the answer is no. We're not living in that world. Are you living in a world in which there's going to be some sort of linear response to this? I think that those populations of people are the most ready, and that it happens between that the illusions we create together. I think that's something that comes out in this paper that we're talking about today as well. That the habituated ideas, the ecology of ideas in a city are shared ideas about what the city is, about what life is, about why we get up and go to work, about why we send our kids to school. What is in the ecology of ideas there? And if that ecology of ideas shifts, then all the actions and the possibilities that come out of that shift are shifted. There's all sorts of new possibilities. But I think it's there.
As you know, Nora, as an organization, UNDP has started a big experiment by establishing what we call accelerator labs across the world. We started in 60 countries, now it's more than 100 countries. And a lot of it is actually intended to get better at listening, get better at learning, and be part of the ecosystem in which we operate, rather than the kind of more rigid linear structures of solution seeking that we are used to in the past. Yet a lot of what we do as in the international development community at large is the same old. It's we develop a solution to a problem that we think we see, we implement that solution and we evaluate it. And if anybody pays attention to the evaluation later on, he or she gets an impression of whether it worked or not from that linear perspective. Now, with the work with Luca in this context, a little side question to Luca in this context. The work with Luca really is about shifting this away from this projectized way of thinking and making sure that we move towards portfolios of options, so that all these different color pots that you described in the very beginning of our discussion are actually not just sitting there and don't get connected, but they do form a new picture, actually a painting of sorts that leads us away from this linear thinking. Luca, how do you see this space of working with UNDP in cities on portfolios of options as to what you've seen in the beginning? Do you see hope for us to get into that space?
There always is hope. In fact, I would say the message that I would give you comes from the 1920s. Keynes was writing to the world when the world was collapsing in manners not dissimilar from how it's happening now, and literally said to it, there's no reason why we should not believe in the possibility of things. So I certainly believe in the possibility of the UNDP making itself relevant to the moment and to the necessities that come in the future to developing countries. Definitely it's possible, and certainly I see a lot of good movement around, specifically in this instance, I would say that you should open up your space and listen, for instance, to someone like Nora is probably an index of a hopeful situation. Since you've given me the word, one thing I want to make sure, listening to Nora is a luxury, and I want to make sure that I don't spoil that for you in any way. So one thing that I would really want to underscore here is something which I heard Nora say, which is really important, it seems to me, when it comes to development, and what I see being the dominant paradigms that currently still determine what's good or what's bad inside development. And I would definitely underscore the bit where you say it's those communities that are frail, miserable, desperate, broken, that suffer the consequences of a situation, that are aware and capable of understanding complexity and using that understanding to lift themselves from that situation. Now, there is a lesson there for those who want to listen, because what I see as dominant is almost a contrary paradigm, one that says poor people need ease and simple, the quick solution, the minimum viable option, the things that we are so rather trite, really, that we say, and they need this now. And I would say, well, you might be misunderstanding what it is that they are experiencing and what it is that they can do with themselves. So probably I would really underscore that. It seems to me that you heard something quite important coming here from Nora in terms of the UNDP. Now, I know that it's not all like that. And of course, the work that you're doing with me assumes that you accept that there may be contexts that need to be addressed in different ways. And building a portfolio of options is paradigmatic with respect to that. Just so that we understand, why does that matter in terms of complexity? Complexity. So interestingly, where the conversation started with Nora was the question, something new is happening. I'm not sure. So I don't think that complexity is new. I mean, complexity has been there as an endemic feature of the world, probably from long ago. There is an increased awareness on our side of complexity because it is now challenging us with a very idiosyncratic problem. Complexity is a property of the world. We have a problem with respect to complexity, which is uncertainty. We just don't know now what to do given the complexity that we finally recognize is there. And we need to form actions and decisions that support those actions. And this is really where we are struggling. The difficulty that we have, individual agents, social systems, to take decisions with respect to the situation we are in. and decisions about which we have to acknowledge from the very beginning, which we're hearing Nora say, which is there probably isn't a very clear representation of the problem, but there certainly isn't a solution that comes from whatever you say of this. You have to go in there. And by being in that situation, learn your way out of it. And, you know, the key word when you asked Nora about warm data, I would say, well, the key word there is learning. It's learning through the information that comes to you, with probably that element that, you know, I think policymakers might be more comfortable with, I imagine, certainly inside the walls of your institution, which is that of intelligence. Now, you know, intelligence unfortunately seems to have been hacked by other people who do different things with it, but it's an extraordinarily unique human capability. And I love the word, by the way, because in its Latin origin, it's interlegere, which literally means to read between, which of course tells you there is no such thing as existent in the world. You know, this is not something that's there. It's something that we make of the information that the world gives us. And it's our product. It's our sense of, you know, what does it in fact mean? And on account of that, form an action. You know, say, okay, if this is what it means, I will therefore move into that space. But you learn that. You learn by being in the world and recognizing the, you know, the noise, the messiness, the complexity, the difficulty, the fundamental uncertainty that's constantly with your companion, your travel mate. And what a portfolio of option does, technically, since ultimately I suspect you want me to get there, is literally acknowledge that situation when it comes to interventions. You know, how do we enter into a system and do something about it? And I would say it does it at two levels. It puts you there. So options are genuine, grounded experiences. Is the moment in which you don't look at a book or display whatever informational assets you have about what you think is there, but you're actually there. And then you begin to create relationships with the there. You know, it's the primary relationship is with that, but then relationship between things, relationships with the new, and of course, if you are a learning system, and you know, human systems are extraordinarily poor at giving themselves a direction. You know, they do it every day, but they fail constantly in getting it right. They're extremely good at learning, and that's how they supplement with the other deficit, which is they're just constantly making it up, learning their way into a solution, which of course never really exists. You know, it's just a temporary arrangement with which we can consolidate our sense of being there and move on. A portfolio of options does that in a structured, disciplined, rigorous, technical way, if you want. Hopefully, a portfolio of strategic options, which is really what primarily we bring to that, is building a system capability. So it's not giving a system a solution, which unfortunately is the old paradigm of development. You know, we know your problem and we are the experts who tell you what the solution is. Here it is, which frankly has not produced magic results. Whereas what matters, which I would say is almost the warm heart of development, which is here is a capability, and make that become an ontology of those systems, a backbone, something that they hold and can in fact use to take decisions about themselves and learn about complexity, engage with its significance, form the actions that they need to have on account of what they understand to be their sense of self and their destiny. I would say a portfolio of strategic options is that noble gift. It's where you're literally you're bringing a capability and saying, this is how you could do it. And then you let them do it, frankly. That's what they, and my experience is when you do that, nothing is more precious to the resilience of a system than the capability it has to take decisions about itself. So that's what you're giving to them if you are developing portfolios of strategic options. And that, of course, is a country, a system, a village, a person. It doesn't really make a big difference.
Thank you, Luca. In the beginning of your response, you tapped upon uncertainty, which may be one of the big words describing the times that we live in right now when we look into history books at someday. I'd like to bridge from uncertainty also to flexibility, which is so closely connected to the portfolio of options that you just described. Nora, in his book, The Steps to an Ecology of Mind, your father highlights the value of flexibility in an urban setting that is able to create an environment of ongoing complex systems. And he specifically talks about flexibility as uncommitted potentiality of change or for change. What does it mean to have this kind of flexibility or an uncommitted potentiality for change from that perspective? What does it mean for you?
Well, I think I would start by thinking about this notion of an ecology itself. What's an ecology? And in an ecology, a meadow or a family or your body, there are these thresholds. And, if it gets too hot for too long, the meadow dies. If it gets too wet for too long, the meadow dies. And what we're talking about is how the survivability is produced between organisms within those thresholds. That's the flexibility. And the flexibility is at another level too. When it comes to human systems and societies, what we're also talking about is the flexibility of perception, of thought, of assumptions. And so there's a few different kinds of flexibility that we're talking about at the same time. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. Because it's easy enough to think, oh, well, we just have to be flexible. But that would be not rigorous enough. We've got to go in a little deeper than that. So, one of the examples he uses is that, when population gets too high and there's not enough of something, water, food, whatever, then some kind of technology is developed to bring more water in or to grow more food and transport it in. To in that sense, gain some more possibility of allowing this thing to continue. And in that sense, the words he uses that we're spending the flexibility, because it's not like that was going to be, we could just keep doing that forever. You can't just keep creating more technology that will allow the system that is already beyond capacity to continue. That's an expenditure of flexibility that is, it comes back around, right? He says ecology won't be mocked. You can try for a while and you might get away with it, and you can do this and you can do that, but eventually it's going to come back for you. So there's another kind of flexibility, which is the flexibility of asking, how are we living in this world? What changes could happen at another level? Where is the possibility? Where's the possibility? And that's not so much about the ecological flexibility. That's about, in terms of the natural world, that's about the ecological flexibility in terms of our ways of perceiving and thinking. And I put on the board here, I don't know if you can read this, but as a quote from the paper that says, the problem of how to transmit our ecological reasoning to those whom we wish to influence in what would appear to be a good way is in itself an ecological problem. Okay, and this is where really I see that there is a loss of flexibility. The way in which we are even talking about ecology is landing inside a culture of communication that's looking for pragmatic, solution bound, measurable impact, all those things that you described. Okay, so what happened when we started talking about complex systems and ecologies is that then we started to develop very mechanistic ways of talking about complexity. And you know, this quote was written 50 years ago. And I would say that this is probably one of the most important issues of our time. How do we actually start to talk about the living, difficult, blurry processes that we live within in a way that matches or meets that complexity? Okay, so that was, you remember when we did algebra a million years ago, and we got told that you couldn't add x plus y because they weren't the same. There was a different kind of variable, right? And that they had to be congruent. You can add x's to x's, but you can't add x's to y's. And in this sense, we are trying to meet the complexity that is living, moving, shifting with a kind of very structured, now it's very complicated, but I still don't think it's complex, a very structured approach that wants to freeze it in time, freeze each little piece apart from each other, and deal with the little pieces. So the actual flexibility, I think, that's most needed now is a flexibility of perception, a flexibility of communication, a flexibility that says we need to be able to actually meet the complexity on the ground in these communities, in these cities. And when I do systemic work, there's no way that you could ever make a spreadsheet that could hold systemic response. Sometimes it continues across multiple orders of relationship for decades. Right? There is no KPI that you can fit systemic work into because it's moving through multiple contexts. So I do warm data, for example, with a group of people. We're talking about education. And the next day they phone me up and they say, hey, I called my sister for the first time in 12 years. Or, you know what? I quit smoking. So something about what they perceived in the context of the discussion around education produced a shift in perception about their own lives, their own bodies. So then they quit smoking, and then their sister or their family or someone in their town becomes involved in some kind of exercise program that this person gets involved in because they quit smoking, and they bring their kids in, and then it becomes something that schools are involved in. How are you going to fit stuff like that in a KPI? It just doesn't fit. So I feel like we have a real problem because the work we have to do is deeply complex and systemic, and the processes that are reading the productivity or the efficiency of the work cannot read systemic process. How's that? I mean, I know it's provocative, but really, I think this is a serious issue. And how do we begin to deal with this? Because that's where we need the flexibility, is in the capacity even to talk about it. And that flexibility then becomes a flexibility of perception that goes into the communication, into the formation of the relationships, and produces, guess what? More flexibility. So it's a really interesting thing when we're saying we have to do complexity, but we have to do it just like we did everything else. And we can't do that. So I feel like there's it's swimming lessons, and we're all kind of holding on to the side of the pool, because it's scary, and also because we have to do it together, right? So I feel that a lot of political bodies their hands are sort of tied, because the structures that they're working with are held by business. But the business community is also kind of stuck, because the structures they're working with are held by, urban planners, and the structures they're working with are held by political bodies. And everyone's kind of like an ecology, right? This is an ecology. Just like in a meadow, all these organisms are completely interdependent. All of the institutional processes are also interdependent. And so my question would be, what can we bring into that ecology that would allow it to start to learn to be in its world in a new way? Back to that violin example. How does a system learn? Because the learning is the flexibility, that is the potentiality, that's the space. But the learning isn't in the education system. It's not in the political system. It's not in it's in between. It's in you and me. And we are walking, talking, learning, living processes that are all of those systems combined. All the past and all the future generations. We're all right here. So what can we say? What can we do? And when we talk about uncertainty, I think that it's uncertain. It's uncertain. But if you put uncertainty inside time, what you're asking for is spontaneity. You're asking for like an improvisational actor. You don't know what's happening next, so you have to pay attention to the multiple contexts, and you have to respond in spontaneity. And so I don't know. I'm interested in that as a possible way to look at this too. Meanwhile, I don't know what to say, except that the flexibility that is needed. If there is a communication to the people in the cities and the communities that says, you need to now live in this new way, that communication itself will create an ecology of response. Okay, it is an ecological thing to create that communication, and then you're going to get a pushback, right? So that right now, even the SDGs have become a symbol around which a lot of right-wing or other groups have pushback. So the communication is part of the ecology too.
It's a very interesting link, Nora and Luca, between uncertainty and flexibility in a way. Our desire for certainty in everything we do, our world of KPIs, our desire to control and measure what we do, actually finds its limitations already in that Excel sheet. If you wish. We are realizing already in that linear world where the limitations to actually measures sit, without actually exposing ourselves to thinking in the context of complex systems. So having made that link in this discussion, I think is a very important consideration for us to learn better, or in a way to start unlearn. The more I listen to you, the more I'm wondering how much we actually need to unlearn in order to free that space in our minds to kind of rewire in a different way. Is unlearning part of what would come to your mind as well, or do you feel this is just a constant learning process in which sooner or later we will get there?
Nora, do you mind if I answer the question? I don't want anyone to unlearn. There's no need to learn. You are who you are, and frankly, we should all be proud for the fact that we are somehow there. It's probably more of layering additional elements to whatever we are and whoever we are, recognizing that, of course, we become, learning does have a dimension of path dependency. It's always you learning, so you will learn as a function of who you are and what you are and where you are. But I would think more of as just expanding, layering, rather than shedding. And I'm not sure if I feel like advocating social unlearning, but definitely there needs to be progress to that extent, and the flexibility, as Nora said, can come in many different ways. But certainly, if you ask the question, which I think Gregory Bateson might have been asking there, of what does a system need to be resilient at first? It does need a budget of possibilities. If it can only be one thing, then it's not going to last very long. So it's the capability that in our system, which is possibly the point of the ecology of mind, is it's a budget of ideas. It's a budget of the possibility of seeing ourselves being different from how we currently are. And the richer that is, the more likely we are to, in fact, as we discover the world, apply to it the good ideas that we are endowed with. So I would say that probably is do more rather than less, and diversify across, and open up to. Again, I started with Keynes. I'm going to end with Keynes. I rather like the guy. And since he's an economist, and then development economists are fundamental. One important thing is he was saying, no reason why we should deny ourselves the possibility of things. I would say, yeah, definitely. We should supply ourselves with a constance in the possibility of things, and a good, well-structured portfolio can do so technically in different contexts, in different ways. The other thing that I would want to bring here about Keynes, which was phenomenal and really important in development, is the practical man is the victim of a dead economist. And I would carry that forward. I would say I see a lot of this happening. A lot of practical ideas that are just legacies of irrelevant and outmoded ways of thinking about the world and its complexity. So I would probably advocate that in terms of how to go forward in uncertainty, which is you have to resolve it. You cannot, there's no way that if it just gels us into inaction, that's not going to do any good. So we have to resolve uncertainty, and we have to constantly resolve uncertainty, supplying ourselves with that budget of ideas that helps us get there, helps us constantly do this.
Mm-hmm. You remind me, Luca, of a quote I noted from a journalist some time back. I can't even name him anymore. It was just scribbled down in passing, where he was saying that development is not a science. It's not measurable in the sense that we would like it to be, but it's actually an endeavor that hopes. It's a struggle for the improvement of the human condition, and in that struggle, the scientific approach is close to absurd, but it's the need to embrace uncertainty is what he was talking about years back in a just passing newspaper article, not in a big intellectual piece, but very interesting and very, in a way, for me, it comes back to my mind when I listen to both of you. And I would suggest also, for the purposes of this podcast to conclude our discussion here with a huge thanks to you, Nora Bateson, for joining us for this. It's a great pleasure for us to have you with us today, and I hope from time to time we'll be able to draw on you and your excellent work in different ways as we keep learning. And of course, it's a great pleasure, Luca, to have you with us for this talk as well. We are in contact very frequently on the joint work that you're leading with us and for us, and for which also many thanks in the context of this particular podcast. So thank you both for taking the time, for being with us. Again, happy anniversary, I should say, to the 50th anniversary of the paper. And thank you for putting the board, Nora, just behind us that reminds us on this critical quote that you have put there. So thank you both very much.